And then it's like, well, what's the name on your birth certificate? And it's like, okay, well, which birth certificate? Because at this point I basically have 3 birth certificates. So it's like, which of those, which of those are you referring to?
Hello, you are listening to NPE Stories. This is a podcast where NPEs can share their story. I am your host, Lily, and I found out I was an NPE through an ancestry DNA test that changed my life forever. NPE is a term that stands for Not Parent Expected or Non-Paternal Event. This means that one or more of our parents are not who we believe them to be. NPE Stories is a podcast where NPEs can share their story of what their original family was like, how they found out they were an NPE, and what their journey has been like since the day they found out. Welcome to episode 176, and today I am speaking with my friend, Ridghaus. Hi, Ridg.
Hi, Lily.
Nice to see you again.
Yeah, you too. I was thinking that since this podcast isn't like a video cast, nobody gets to see your face, the way that I do here. So, that's a shame for them.
We got to spend yesterday sitting on the front porch in rocking chairs, talking for a few hours. I'm so blessed. Thank you for coming over, doing that with me.
Such a good time. Perfect day.
Yeah. How do we know each other?
Yeah, so we met at the Roots Summit, that conference in 2023 that brought DCP, NPE, and Adoption Land all under the same roof. And I was talking with Brad Ewell, and Brad had said something about Eve. And so I followed Eve downstairs as we were having a conversation, and Eve plopped down beside you, and I didn't know you at that moment. And I have this terrible, I don't like to meet new people. Like there's this anxious part that's like, oh, they're not going to like me. This is going to be awkward. And so I have those narratives, just kind of scripted running in the background. But you were just incredibly friendly and kind and engaged in conversation. And so I don't even know if I got to talk with Eve much more that evening. I mean, throughout the course of the conference we did, but like you and I just had this across the table.
We were connected.
Yeah.
We were nodding along with each other. That's for sure.
Yeah. It was very sweet.
I remember that summit was just amazing to be around so many people that understood, and to connect the NPEs and adoptee land people and the DCPs. But I remember being up pretty late with you and Eve and whoever else was with us at that table that night, just talking. And it was great.
Yeah.
I was like listening to parts of your story because you're more in the adoption community. And I said, you're an NPE.
Right.
You're an LDA.
Yeah. As we were talking yesterday, even, I was just thinking, what was the NPE community like, when I found out 17 years ago? Was it nascent? Were there even groups around? Because I know that when you said you got involved, there was still kind of low numbers, and so you were like, to hear stories, I need to make them.
Yeah. Yeah. And 17 years ago, when you found out, I wonder if anything existed in the way of support. And when you found out, you connected more with the adoption world.
Yeah. And I think that's, as I've thought about this, the LDAs have a challenge because many, if not most, adoptees don't have a moment of discovery. And so when LDAs talk about, late discovery adoptees, when LDAs talk about that discovery, we just watch the adoptees' jaws drop, like, oh my God, and what was that like, whereas with NPEs, like you all have that discovery story. But then other things are muddled, because maybe you didn't have a formal adoption, or, there's a lot of secret, so LDAs are kind of in that Venn diagram, of adoptee, NPE, and we're right in the midst of both of those communities.
Instead of speaking about your background story, I think we should do what we discussed yesterday and have you talk about this moment of discovery. This moment of discovery is, as an adult, you finding out you were an LDA.
Yeah.
So what happened to you?
Do you want me to talk about the Thanksgiving dinner or just get right to the phone call?
No, talk about the Thanksgiving dinner and maybe explain who was at that.
Yeah. So in 2005, I was at a Thanksgiving dinner with a couple of my kids, my natural children through my marriage. And also at that dinner was a relinquished son, Zach, as well as his biological mom, Rebecca, and Zach's adoptive mom and adopted sister. And this was the first time that me, Zach, Colleen, Zach's adoptive mom, and Rebecca had been in the same room since Zach's birth. So he's now 15.
And Zach was your
relinquished son. Yeah.
Biological son that was relinquished through adoption. Okay.
Yeah. And so, it was an open adoption. And so I'd always been in touch with Zach, saw him every year, every other year, got phone calls and photographs. And, they had followed through with their agreements around the adoption. So I'd been connected to Zach since the beginning. But this was the first time we were all, together again in this situation. And I found, that I was reflective, what would Zach's life have been like growing up with my other kids. I don't know that I was reflective on the dissolution of the relationship with Rebecca, because we broke up before we found out that he had been conceived. So, but I was just kind of looking around the table, and feeling like, this 15 years ago, this could have been a different story. But it was a good Thanksgiving. It was good to just have that time with everybody. And then about 3 weeks later, I get a letter from the state social services office. And it said, we have some information that may be of interest. Please contact us at your earliest convenience. And this was just before Christmas, 2005. And, Christmas is just a busy time. We had 5 kids at home. I was a professor, so I was just getting out of classes. And I didn't pick up that letter again until after the new year. So another 3 weeks had gone by from getting the letter. At first my thoughts were like, oh, did I have like a long lost cousin who died intestate? And, so there's some kind of will or, property transfer. And so I called, and social worker Tina, she said, oh yeah, I'm looking at your case here and I just need to verify some information from you. So she asked questions about, my birth date, birthplace, information about family. And once everything got through with her, she said that, once she had verified everything, she said, we have received a request for contact from the biological mother. And I remember like hearing her say that, thinking, Rebecca can probably get my number from a half a dozen people. Zach, Colleen, Zach's adoptive dad, Brian. We had 2 or 3 other mutual friends. And I just thought, gosh, this is really weird. And so then I started to do a web search, to verify that Tina was employed with the state, that she was a licensed social worker and, all of this was legitimate. So she's asking questions, I'm asking questions, but I'm typing on the computer. And finally I'm able to, nail down, yep, this is the right office. This is the right number. She's legitimate. And I'm like, okay, so, what's this contact request? And she's like, well, we just, like I said, we got a contact request. And we just wanted to see if you wanted to be in touch with your biological mom. And the pronoun shift, stuck out at me. And I'm like, oh, hold on. You mean Zach's biological mom? She said, no, I mean yours. I said, but I'm not adopted. She said, I'm sorry. I mean, I'm not sorry. I just don't think I should be the first person to tell you this, but you're adopted. And I just started weeping. And in between sobs, I was like, I gotta call you back, And I remember that I had two thoughts, that came up at the same time. One was, oh my God, I'm adopted. Of course, I'm adopted. And the other was, oh my gosh, like, I'm adopted. Why wouldn't anyone ever tell me, So when I got off the phone with Tina, I called my adoptive parents, spoiler, I was adopted. I called my adoptive parents, and Mary, my adoptive mom, answered. And she said, she just answered hello. And I said, hey, I'm trying to reach Dad. And she said, well, he's gone to do laundry. What do you need? And we were estranged. We hadn't had close ongoing contact for a long time. I would stop by and drop off Christmas presents or send birthday cards, stuff like that. But the nature and depth of our relationship had been affected by, their behavioral choices, abuse, alcohol in the family for a long time. So she said, well, he's gone to do laundry. What do you need? And I said, well, quick question. Am I adopted? There was a brief pause, and she started to give me all of the facts about my birth. You were born at this hospital, this doctor delivered you, you had this birth weight, and, immediately I knew, yeah, like this is it. She's going nowhere personal. This is surface level. Here's the facts, and denying essentially, that happened. And then she said, so who's telling you this? I said, funny enough, it's the state of Kansas, and they seem to think that I'm adopted. And she was like, oh, that has to be some kind of mistake.
Oh.
And I was like, okay. I said, well, when Dad gets home, have him give me a call, would you? So I called Tina back. She was distraught. She had never had, a reach out for contact like this, wherein the individual did not know that they were adopted, and so like she was pretty brokenhearted, she was figuring that she had just shattered my world, which was true. And there was also a lot of liberation, in that. I went from being the eldest son of an eldest son, where the eldest son has certain family responsibilities, right? To I don't really owe these people anything at all, especially when I look back at the amount of abuse and trauma, that I had to survive. So while it was, shattering, it was a world upside down moment. There's also a lot of freedom in it. Mm-hmm. So I said, well, listen, you were asking, if I wanted my birth mother contact information, and yeah, send that on over. So she said, you can request your file, like all of the documents we have. I'm going to send you an affidavit. And so I'll send you the contact request, and I will send you the affidavit so you can get all of your files released. And I had the good fortune of being adopted in the state of Kansas, which for all of its other political issues, it never closed adoption. Like, it always left adoption records open. So I felt pretty fortunate about that.
So you received this shocking information, found out you were adopted. What happens from there?
Yeah. The mail could not come fast enough. I knew that it would take a couple of days. This was a Monday when we were talking, and the postage from Tina didn't come until Friday. So I was just watching for the postal carrier to come every day. Walk down. We had a little community mailbox that we would go to, and Friday I get this manila envelope in the mail, from the state. And I'm walking back, opening the envelope, and there's a pile of papers inside, but, one of them is a photocopy of like 4x6 lined note card. And it said, I am looking for baby boy Kyle, in parentheses with a question mark at the end, house, and I just want to know if he's okay. And there was an address in Washington State and a telephone number and her signature, Barbara. And like, my memory just kind of jumps. It's almost like a strobe light effect. Like, I remember opening the envelope. I remember seeing the photocopy of the contact request. I remember looking at her signature and her handwriting and what she had written. But I don't remember like walking in the house. I don't remember picking up the telephone, because I basically called, right away. It's funny to me because we remember this differently as we talk about it. We just had our 17th reunion anniversary, and I recorded, like, I went up to go see her, and we recorded, that first phone conversation. I just pulled out my iPad and turned it towards us, and we had a conversation around it, but we remember it differently. I remember picking up the phone. I remember like dialing the phone number, and a woman answered, and she said, hello. I said, hi, I'm looking for Barbara House. And she said, this is she. And I said, well, this is my name, and I don't really know what to say next. Like, I hadn't thought through more than anything of, I just need to hear this voice and get this figured out. She says that she said, hold on a minute, I need to sit down. And she could have. All I had was silence, on the other end of the phone for a few seconds, But of course, in moments like that, when, the blood is pumping and adrenaline is surging, a few seconds of silence is an eternity. Eventually, what I hear her say is, so do you still live in Kansas, And then we just started talking.
Did Barbara know that you didn't know you were adopted?
No, I think one of the things that she had said was that it was a private adoption, and that they would tell me. And they were also supposed to raise me Catholic, which they did not, because she had like family, Notre Dame alumni, and they were big Catholic family. So she was told, and what she had anticipated was that around 18 or at the latest 21, that I would have the means of reaching out and communicating with her. And when that didn't happen, she grew concerned. She had started a search maybe when I was in my early 20s, and it didn't lead very far. And then shortly after I turned 30, she was like, I need to do this, or I'm just going to always wonder what's happened.
She was looking for you.
Yeah.
How old were you when you found out you were adopted?
I was 35. And as I looked at the dates, like once I got all of my information, from the state as well as what Tina had sent me initially, I got the request to contact, like in the last few weeks of it still being a viable search, from the state's perspective. So she had a 2-year window of opportunity, where they would pursue the case. And that was like we were a month or two, from that closing. So I don't know if anything had ever come, to my adoptive parents' house about that. But I never received any other mail that gave me any indication. So we were really at the tail end of all of this.
So you found out about Barbara, found out you were adopted. You started to connect with Barbara. Did you find out who your birth father was?
Yeah, the first few months of connecting with Barbara was all about just making sure that was one, because my adoptive parents had denied this, making sure that I was indeed the son that she was looking for. I could have imagined a scenario in which I was adopted, she was looking, but the state had made a mistake. And so while I was adopted and she was looking, I was not the person that she was looking for. Right. So I communicated that to her pretty, like in that first phone call. I said, my parents say that I'm not adopted. State seems to think that I am. You have relinquished a son. And, so if we do some DNA testing and we find out that I'm not that son, that I'm willing to stay on board, and help you figure out, whatever you need to find, your guy. So I think about 4 weeks later, we had our DNA results back, and it was unquestionable. But I didn't want to talk about somebody else with her, in that initial getting to know her stage. So we eventually met face to face, and we had a good weekend sampling wine. She owned a winery at that time, making food, listening to music, and just being in one another's presence. And at the tail end of that weekend, I said, well, I do want to know, information about my biological father. And she said that it's not a problem. We can talk about it, ask any questions. So she gave me his name. And when I went back to Kansas that weekend, after that weekend, he was a 5-minute web search, found him right away. Placed a telephone call to the number that was listed and left a voicemail. And a few days later, he called me back. We've been in touch, continuously. We've had family vacations around them. And I'd say largely neither the relationship with Barbara nor the relationship with Ben, my biological father, is everything that I want it to be. I think there's some things that if you just don't get them in childhood, you just don't get them. I believe in inner wisdom and inner healing. And so even if I had gotten that in childhood, if I cannot find it in myself, it doesn't stick. And so ultimately, I am responsible for the care and well-being, of my own soul.
Hmm. Did Barbara have other children after you?
Yeah. So both Barbara and Ben had children, and I grew up with a sister who was also adopted, but she was 5, 6 years younger, and so we never really had a close connection. And once Bill and Mary passed, we actually have not spoken since Mary's funeral, which was 8 years ago. But Liam is Barbara's son. He's also 6 years younger, so he would have been in the age range of Stacy, my adoptive sister. And Liam and I go fishing, crabbing, head out on boats. Last year, he was like, "Hey, do you want to do this hike? Into this, kind of rustic eco resort called Stehekin?" And I'm like, "That sounds awesome. How far is the hike?" He's like, "Oh, I think it's about 12 miles," which, let's be honest, 12 miles, that's a good day hike, right? I mean, you're just going to take some time. Man, I lost all gas on that. And I think that hike had to have been 20 miles. I was flagging. I was like, abandon me. If a bear gets me, I'm okay. I am white. So the next time Liam wants to do a quick little jaunt, I'm like, yeah, okay. Tell me the entry point, tell me the exit point, and I'm going to look this stuff up because I'm not going to do an accidental, almost marathon again. But, we're in each other's lives, and, it's been a really good connection. Ben's other sons are the same age as two of my kiddos. And so I've had a hard time not feeling like they're, little nephews or something. The peer status of those relationships has some challenge.
Yeah. Did your biological parents, Barbara and Ben?
Barbara and Ben.
Now, did their kids, your siblings, were they raised knowing their parents had a relinquished son out there?
Liam knew. Yeah. And Liam and I connected pretty much right away. Within the first week, I think. Like, I really wanted to make sure that Barbara and I were connected. But through email or telephone, Liam and I chatted. And so Liam had always known that I was out there. Ben had shared that, he suspected he had a son because Barbara and Ben broke up before, like she told him she was pregnant and they broke up. So he suspected, there was a child out there, but he had not confirmed that. And so he told his wife at the time that, hey, I think I have a son out there. But I don't think his kids knew.
So what were the circumstances around Barbara surrendering you for adoption? Do you know?
Barbara's dad, and I'm going to put that in there because Barbara has her own NPE that I've recently discovered and shared with her that she didn't know about.
No.
Barbara's dad died when she was 13. So it was Barbara and her mom and a little brother. And Barbara had left mother's home to go to college. It was during the summer after her freshman year of college that she met Ben. They dated for a while, and then when she found out that she was pregnant, Ben reacted negatively, and so she was like, "I'm not going to stay in a relationship, that puts me or this child at risk." So Ben never spoke with him until we all made reunion together.
So Barbara and Ben broke up, and at some point she decided to relinquish you for adoption.
Yeah. So without family connection, Barbara had decided that it would be too much for her to go back to school, raise a child, and without that level of support, having babysitters or finances or whatever, she just thought that it would be too much trying to raise a baby. And so she hoped to find a good family and give me a better chance.
Did that happen?
As I reflect on the home that I was raised in and looking at both Barbara as well as my brother Liam, I think that Liam had more opportunities than I did. Barbara married a guy. They were upwardly mobile with finances. They were, tail end of hippie kind of life. They had a houseboat, on a lake out in Washington's Peninsula, and, just hiked in the woods and made their life for a while. But there are ways in which Barbara's underlying personality are very similar to my adoptive mom's personality. And so I think some things would have been exactly the same, if I'd grown up with Barbara or if I'd grown up, as I did with Mary. The things that probably would not have been the same are the level of physical, emotional, sexual abuse that I encountered. The overall intelligence of, Barbara, Liam, Tom, her husband at the time, and her subsequent boyfriends. Like I've met as we've traveled around the country, like she keeps introducing me to, oh, I dated this guy and I dated this guy, and these are all like tender-hearted geniuses, in like engineering and biochemistry. And I mean, they're just accomplished individuals. So I think the intellectual environment would have been significantly different. I would have felt perhaps less awkward about just being a smart kid, with no peers. I had one guy that I grew up with, and we're still in touch, and we've had conversations around this. But if it weren't for Carl, I probably would have abandoned all kind of intellectual academic interests, for the sake of fitting in with schoolmates a long time ago.
I know your last name, and it sounds like it's the same last name as your biological mom's.
Yeah.
Did you do a name change? What happened there?
Yeah. So in 2017, my adoptive father and mother had passed. And, in that kind of just grief space, because even though the relationships were terrible, like that's still a loss.
Absolutely.
So I was sitting in a reflection, and I was like, okay, Bill, Mary, there is no generation now between me and death. So, like I'm next in that tier. And I had this whole like visualization of it. All of my kids under me. And so I am between them and death, but death, like I'm the next in that line. And as I started to think about the kids, and I just started to think about, just family in that regard, this subsequent thought came in, and it was like, Barbara's still around. Ben is still around. Like you still have that generational margin, and not only is Ben still around, but Ben's parents are still living, and so like on Ben's side, like I'm still 2 generations removed from death. And so I just started to contemplate that. And I thought, man, what would it be like to be adopted by Ben and Barbara? The original first parents. Not that I had some fantasy about them reconnecting and marrying each other. That would be a disaster. But just being what it should have been. So I called Barbara and I said, "Hey, what do you think about, adopting me?" And she said, "I'm just ashamed that I didn't think of that first." So we started to plan, an adoption, an adult adoption. I eventually started to conceptualize this around three things. One, it's not legally, it's an adoption, right? But it's really an unadoption because it's taking things back to that entry point. So it's a redo. And there's a little bit of irony in that in order to show that she and I have a relationship, legally, she has to adopt me, which was the reason that she and I didn't have a legal relationship because someone else had adopted me. And so I just started to think about the dramatic irony of going through an adoption to be connected to biological family again, So that felt a little mischievous, and I definitely have a trickster part that loves those little ironies. And Ben and I had a lot of conversations around it, and this was actually a thing that kind of interrupted the level of comfort that we had with each other, because he said, I don't want to have a relationship with Barbara. And I am not about arm twisting, for anybody. And I said, listen, if you can't see that this isn't about Barbara, it's about me, I don't know what to do for you. So yeah, in 2017, we did an adoption and changed my name, to reflect both of their names. So that's where Ridghaus comes from. A little bit of him, a little bit of her.
Were you supposed to be named Kyle? Maybe boy Kyle?
That was her plan. And, with adoption, I've got a friend, Kara Sky, who does adoptee writing. And she just posted something a couple of days ago on her Instagram where it was like, question as simple as what's your name can be so confounding for adoptees. Because, and there was a series of slides. It's like, well, you mean like the name that I call myself, or the name that, I'm not sure what you mean by name. Well, the name your parents first gave you. And it's like, oh, okay, which parents, And then it's like, well, what's the name on your birth certificate? And it's like, okay, well, which birth certificate, Because at this point I basically have 3 birth certificates. So it's like, which of those, which of those are you referring to? So at the time, Barbara didn't realize that, and I want to say this with a lot of, with as much softness as I can. There are many times that adoptive parents choose a different name than what the biological parents have given. And that can be because of family, like they want to honor somebody from back in their family. But I wonder how many times that happens because they're just not doing their work around a sense of loss in that this is not their biological child. And so they choose to name as a, as a means of, this is mine, when they know that it isn't. And, I'm not trying to scapegoat. It's just what it is. And Zach, both Colleen and Rebecca named Zach, so Zach has the name that Rebecca was, planning. So it is often the case that adoptees will see a completely different name on their original birth certificate, if they can even get their original birth certificate, as some states don't release those still. But yeah, I think Kyle was supposed to be the name. And, to be honest, I'm grateful. I've had friends over the years, very dear to me, named Kyle, and I appreciate their friendship. But for the most part, Kyle has not been like my bestie, So with me walking around with Kyle,
you'll always be Ridg to me. You are so involved in the adoption community. When I went to the summit last year, you gave the closing ceremonies, you gave us some self-care tips. I see you on the NAPS website. You've done video work for adoption community content. Is this part of your healing?
I would say yes, that there's that I get a lot out of the community. These are the people that, have brought me in, have cared for me when I found myself kind of floundering or flailing, that they've really, they've really shown up. And for adoptees, and I can't speak for NPEs, and I don't think you're a monolith, but for somebody to show up when you've had a moment like this in your life where the people who were closest to you didn't show up, like it's a meaningful thing, it's like, okay, yeah, these are my people. Mm-hmm. And I think that the video work that I've done, it's, I don't know if you've encountered this in the NPE community, but I'm all about people telling their stories. I think that's one of the ways that we come to own our story, to be able to speak part of it at one time and another part at another, to find those moments of what's important right now. Is the story about advocacy? Is the story about affirmation? Is the story about community and connection? So I can share various parts of my story, based on what's needed, but I needed to know my own story, which also contributed to a sense of identity. And knowing my story, I know more of who I am. And while I always advocate for people to share their stories, there are a lot of stories out there that are unpolished, and the content will not reach beyond the emotions of the community. And so if someone wants to, change hearts and minds towards like legislative action, opening records, changing some upstream policies around whether birth certificates are even sealed, requiring biological relatives to be a part of birth certificates, right? I mean, because that's a part of heritage we can miss out on. So if someone is telling their story just to share the story and it's in community, I understand that. If they're telling the story because they want to change hearts and minds, there's a lot of work that needs to go into making the stories accessible beyond the pathos of the initial telling. People need to understand, especially those who have never had a discovery. They don't know that knock on the head of, wait, what? Like that just doesn't compute. And so they need to be able to hear the stories in a way that brings them into, this is what it's like to find out this person that you spent, the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years with, they're not actually biologically related to you. And that doesn't have to affect the relationship that you have with them, but it can, because it communicates they're willing to keep a secret from you. They are either driven by, shame or a loyalty, to someone else. And they're unwilling to hold you as a autonomous person worthy of all respect, because they're going to keep this from you. You just don't need to know that. And they make that decision, right? And that's really hard for people to understand, mm-hmm. because most of the population never has to go through that. Mm-hmm. LDAs, NPEs, like we're like, okay, yeah. And so we hear somebody's story around that and we're like, oh man, my heart, like I remember that moment for myself. And if we're going to advocate change, legislation or social consciousness, we need good quality pieces going out that help people understand that change.
That makes sense. And I know you're in media production, you've told me. Do you do that line of work within the adoption community as well?
my my academic bona fides, right? I have a master's in literature and rhetoric, and then I have a master's in film and like broadcast communication. Mm-hmm. So what I ended up doing with those is like working for like Food Network, Bravo, not in the editing capacity, but I hung around with enough editors, to pick up some tips. And like when we did 6-word adoption memoirs, I had a Finnish editor who got it. He was a great colorist, not in adoption land at all, but he understood the stories, and so he worked with me, on polishing, the color and the smoothness, of these. So I did both teaching media as well as doing media, and I kind of bounce back and forth between those things.
Mm-hmm. Can I put a link in for the 6-word adoption memoirs?
Yeah, I'll send you a couple of the Vimeo links. The other thing about my content is I don't think any content should be paywalled. When people tell their stories, I feel a great debt of gratitude for their vulnerability, and I don't want to put anything behind a paywall. So all of the 6-word stuff is freely available, if you can find it. So I can send you some Vimeo links to that.
That would be great. And I'm nodding along with you, since this is a podcast, with when people share their stories with you, this is something so special and an honor, and it should be done in a safe place and not something that necessarily should be, profited off of. I totally right there with you, even though the labor behind it is quite intensive.
Right. Yeah. Which is also to say, if somebody wants to donate, okay, I'm open to taking donation, but, don't make the content because I'm trying to make money off of it. And it's okay. Like, therapists who see adoptees or whatever, like they have trained, in their profession. Even if they're an adoptee or an NPE themselves, they have spent money, and developing skills to do this. So I don't have any problem with someone saying, hey, buy my book, or, to see an adoption competent therapist or an identity competent therapist, it's going to cost you $150 an hour or whatever. So just me, I feel like my content needs to be free.
Have you done any therapy or support groups that you have found helpful with your healing?
My friend David Quint, he's another filmmaker. He is a lineal descendant of an adoptee. And he did a film called Father Unknown, which is so moving. The first time I watched it, I immediately hit, restart and watch it again, in the same setting. It's just so good. Anyway, David and I were driving. He lives in Denver. We were driving over to see some people. And I think one of my other podcasts had recently come out then, because I've talked about different aspects of my journey in other podcasts. David said something like, Ridg, why have you, only been in the community for, 10 years, and yet you have this like sense of wholeness that people who've been in the community for longer don't have, or that he doesn't always see. And I said, well, I grew up with 2 drunks, so I've been in therapy for a long time, well before I found out that I was adopted. The first therapies that I went to, they were basically talk, therapies, maybe something in the Gestalt realm, or an early form of cognitive behavioral. So like I've seen therapists for a long time. The problem that I have with most talk therapy is that without sounding arrogant, I'm often smarter than the therapist, and psychology has always been a fascination of mine. And so, like, before they even ask two questions, I already know, like, where the conversation's going, and I'm 10 steps ahead. And I'm like, you're not going to be able to help walk me out of these woods here. I know what you're going to say, and nope, didn't work. I still feel the same way. So talk therapy hasn't always landed. One of the first times that I had a meaningful kind of breakthrough where therapy felt like something, I was working with a somatic therapist in LA, and I was working on shows out there, and I happened to meet somebody who did this particular kind of therapy, and he was full, but he gave me her name, and I reached out to her. She had me do breath work, which felt completely uncomfortable in my system. We were activating the sympathetic nervous system, and then she would do a combination of talking as well as like having me move, or she would move, towards or away from me, in a role playing kind of setting. And she gave me a series of what I think she called well baby messages. And in the sympathetic nervous system activation, I would then kind of go through these well baby messages, of that's how any little boy would feel, facing that situation. It's okay. I think that being on top of some of the, talk therapy that I'd gone through, that I found a lot of meaning and spaciousness within myself from that. Over the last few years, I have gotten into some like THC for therapeutic value, which I just want to clarify. I don't mean I'm going to hit a bowl and have a pizza dropped off and watch Firefly or The Simpsons or something. I would get into a meditative space, and I would take a 2.5 milligram mint, and I would say, okay, this is my body and brain right now. Here's the mint. What do I notice in my body? What do I notice in my brain coming on, as the THC begins to take effect, and I would just kind of meditate in that space, so that I began to feel a sense of like wholeness as a result. And I did that, once or twice a week, once every other week, for probably a year. And I think that developed a lot of safety, like I'm okay with me. I worked with a narrative coach for 6 months. She was fabulous. And that was also a lot about talking through my story. What is my body saying? Because if we don't have a relationship, like our first relationship is with our body. The brain likes to think, I got this, I can take care of all this stuff. But our first relationship is here. So, and then over the last, let's say since 2020, other psychedelic therapies have been instructive, particularly psilocybin. And in fact, I have a panel where we're going to talk about this on December 3rd.
What's that word?
Psilocybin. Yeah, those are magic mushrooms. Magic mushrooms, either in microdoses or in a heroic dose. I did a heroic dose back in 2020. And so much insight, poured out of that session. I think there's a lot of opportunity. I don't see psychedelics as a silver bullet. I think you got to do a lot of work before you can have a session. And I think you have a lot of work to do after the session. If you think about a moment when somebody said something, that really stepped on your toes, and you have this sense of like shoulders are up, the brain starts to race. In IFS, internal family systems, we call these protectors, right? And the protector's job is to keep your toes from getting stepped on. And the protectors are most worried about you, like your protectors are protecting you. So they don't mind stepping on somebody else's toes or, giving somebody kind of a shove away emotionally and maybe even physically if necessary. But your protectors are there to protect you. In psychedelic therapies, ketamine, psilocybin, the protectors are not, they're not done away with. They're not locked down, but they have a different kind of awareness. And so you can really get into some deep work, particularly in the integration, because the protectors are just willing to relax, Those things don't feel so dangerous,
Wow.
So IFS, psychedelics, narrative therapy, somatic, it's been a lot of modalities. And actually, as I'm dropping these out, I'm thinking the psychedelic one will not be recorded. So it's December 3rd. There was another person at the Roots Summit, Beth Syverson. She's putting together the panel, but she has an Instagram channel, Unraveling Adoption. And last week, I was talking about psychedelics and healing on her podcast. So that came out a week ago. And then, but in November, I will be talking about internal family systems and this community around identity for Jeanette Yoff's conference. And Jeanette has a counseling therapy center called the Celia, Celia, Celia Center. She's doing a thing, I think, a second weekend of November. So I'll be doing an intro to IFS there. Being a level 2 IFS practitioner has given me a lot of tools for deepening my own work. So I think all of those things work together in creating a better sense of identity and wholeness.
Ridg, if people wanted to get in touch with you or ask you questions, can they do that?
Yeah, the easiest way to connect with me is through Instagram. I keep, an at Ridghaus, Ridghaus, Ridghaus on Instagram. And that's, pop into DMs or, make a comment on whatever. Instagram is probably my most often frequented modality for connecting with the wider world.
Including me.
Including you, yeah. Although you and I do have, the opportunity to text and call and sit on porches and rock and chair.
Yeah.
That's my preferred way. If somebody wants to come over and sit on a rocking chair, that's my preferred way of connecting.
I'll have to post the picture of you drinking your broth and me wrapped in a blanket on the rocking chairs yesterday. Yeah. It was wonderful spending time with you.
Such a good time.
Thank you for sharing we haven't had an LDA on in quite a while, so thank you for sharing the NPE portion of your story and going through all that with me and just spending time with me. You're an important person to me, Ridg, so thank you.
Thank you, Lily. You're dear to me too.
These stories are here for us to identify with. If you are an NPE and would like to share your story, email npestories@gmail.com. You do not have to give any identifying information. If you are an NPE and would like to share your story, I'd like to hear from you. Subscribe to this podcast to hear more. Come heal with us.